At noon, across the Japanese archipelago, millions gather around radio speakers. Factory workers, farmers, housewives, soldiers, all waiting in tense silence. Then, through static and interference, they hear something unprecedented, the voice of their emperor. For 2,600 years, the emperor had been divine, distant, untouchable. Now, Emperor Hirohito speaks directly to his people, announcing Japan's surrender. August 15, 1945. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he says in formal court language most can barely understand. But the meaning is clear. The empire has fallen. The unthinkable has happened. Japan has been defeated. What follows that moment of surrender is one of history's most remarkable transformations. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the nation lay in ruins, its people facing the greatest test of survival and renewal in their history. Over 3 million dead, 9 million homeless, 66 cities reduced to ash and rubble. The mighty empire that had conquered half of Asia was now utterly broken, occupied by foreign troops for the first time in its history. But this is not a story of defeat. This is the story of how a devastated nation rose from the ashes, not through military might, but through an extraordinary transformation that would reshape the world. This is the story of Japan's rebirth. August 6, 1945. At 8:15 a.m., the world changed forever. The atomic bomb detonated 1,900 feet above Hiroshima, releasing the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. In an instant, 80,000 people vanished. Tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks from radiation sickness. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just the final blows in a campaign of destruction that had been methodically dismantling Japan for months. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th, 1945, had killed more people in a single night than either atomic bomb. General Curtis LeMay's B-29 superfortresses dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs on the city's densely packed wooden neighborhoods. The resulting firestorm created winds so powerful they uprooted trees and hurled people through the air. The canals boiled. People jumped into water tanks to escape the heat, only to be cooked alive. By morning, 100,000 were dead, and 1 million were homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo, the heart of the ancient capital, had been incinerated. And Tokyo was not alone. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, every major industrial center had been systematically destroyed. By August 1945, American bombers faced a grim problem. They were running out of cities to bomb. Japan's urban areas had been transformed into vast fields of ash and twisted metal. The wooden homes that had housed millions were gone. The factories that had produced weapons were silent ruins. The proud industrial infrastructure that had powered Japan's military expansion had been reduced to rubble. The numbers tell only part of the story. Over 3 million Japanese were dead. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, children. 9 million were homeless, living in shanties built from corrugated metal and scavenged wood. 13 million had been displaced from their homes. The great cities that had been centers of culture, commerce, and power were unrecognizable landscapes of destruction. But beyond the physical devastation was something deeper, something harder to quantify. A spiritual crisis. Japan's empire, which at its height had stretched from the gates of India to the islands of the Pacific, had vanished overnight. The military leaders who had promised glory and prosperity had delivered only catastrophe and death. The ideology that had justified expansion and conquest, that Japan was destined to lead Asia, that the emperor was divine, that surrender was unthinkable, lay shattered like the cities themselves. For ordinary Japanese, the shock went beyond material loss. Many had sent their sons, husbands, and fathers to die in what they believed was a sacred mission. They had endured years of rationing, of air raids, of constant fear, all while being told that victory was certain, that suffering was noble, that the enemy would never set foot on sacred Japanese soil. Now, American soldiers were landing at Japanese ports. The emperor had spoken of surrender. Everything they had been taught to believe, everything they had sacrificed for, was revealed to be a lie. In this moment of absolute zero, with their cities destroyed, their economy shattered, their political system discredited, and their national identity in crisis, the Japanese people faced an existential question. Who are we now? If we are not an empire, not a military power, not a divine nation destined to rule, then what are we? The answer to that question would not come from the government, which had collapsed into paralysis. It would not come from the military, which had been discredited and disbanded. It would come, instead, from the most unlikely source, from the foreign occupation force that now controlled their defeated nation. And it would begin with the arrival of one man, General Douglas MacArthur.
August 30th, 1945. 2 weeks after Japan's surrender, a C-54 transport plane touches down at Atsugi Air Base, outside Tokyo. The door opens, and out steps General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. He's 65 years old, 6 feet tall, wearing his trademark sunglasses and corncob pipe. He descends the stairs without a weapon, without visible security, landing on enemy soil as if he owned it. It's a moment of supreme confidence, even arrogance, and it's exactly the kind of theatre MacArthur loves. For Japan, it's a moment of profound humiliation and uncertainty. This is the first time in 2,600 years of recorded history that foreign troops have occupied the Japanese islands. Ancient Japan had faced Mongol invasions in the 13th century, but the kamikaze, divine winds, had destroyed the invasion fleets. Now there would be no divine intervention. The Americans were here, and they were in control. But MacArthur understood something that many conquerors throughout history had not, that Japan's transformation couldn't be imposed by force alone. Yes, he had 500,000 troops at his disposal. Yes, he held absolute power over a defeated nation. But he also recognized that lasting change required something more subtle. It required working through Japanese institutions, making the Japanese people partners in their own transformation, giving them ownership of the process. On September 27, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made an extraordinary journey. He traveled to the US Embassy in Tokyo to meet MacArthur. The photograph taken that day would become one of the most significant images of the 20th century. On the left stands MacArthur, tall, relaxed, hands in his pockets, wearing his casual military uniform without tie. On the right stands Hirohito, small, rigid, formally dressed in striped morning trousers and cutaway coat. The symbolism was unmistakable. The old order had been replaced. The divine emperor now stood before the American general as a supplicant. But MacArthur made a crucial decision in that moment. Many Allied leaders wanted Hirohito tried as a war criminal. The Soviet Union demanded his execution. Public opinion in America and Britain called for his punishment. MacArthur disagreed. He believed that maintaining the emperor, while stripping him of power, would provide stability and continuity that Japan desperately needed. The emperor was the one institution that could bridge the old Japan and the new, that could give legitimacy to the radical reforms that were coming. Hirohito, for his part, had come prepared to sacrifice himself. He told MacArthur that he bore sole responsibility for the war and was ready to face any punishment. MacArthur was moved by this gesture. Rather than punishing Hirohito, he would transform him, from a distant divine figure into a symbol of Japan's new democratic future. The occupation that followed was unprecedented in scope and ambition. MacArthur and his staff, many of them idealistic New Deal progressives, set out to fundamentally remake Japanese society. The reforms came rapidly, almost breathtakingly so. First, the dismantling of the military apparatus. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were dissolved. Officers were purged from public life. The secret police were abolished. The ultra-nationalist organizations that had promoted militarism were banned. Japan's capacity to make war was systematically eliminated. Second, economic restructuring. The zaibatsu, the massive family-controlled conglomerates that had dominated the economy and financed the war, were broken up. Their assets were distributed, their monopolistic power curtailed. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about creating competitive markets and preventing the concentration of wealth and power that had contributed to militarism. Third, land reform. In rural Japan, most farmers were tenant farmers, renting land from wealthy landlords and living in poverty. The occupation forces purchased land from landlords at fixed prices and sold it cheaply to the farmers who worked it. Within a few years, nearly 90% of farmland was owner-operated. This created a class of independent farmers with a stake in the new democratic system. Fourth, labor rights. Workers gained the right to organize unions, to strike, to bargain collectively. Labor laws protected workers from exploitation. Within 2 years, union membership exploded from virtually nothing to over 5 million workers. Fifth, and perhaps most revolutionary, women's rights. Japanese women gained the right to vote, to own property, to divorce, to have equal access to education. In the first post-war election in 1946, 39 women were elected to the Diet, more female legislators than in the United States Congress at the time. These reforms faced resistance. Conservative Japanese politicians were horrified, business leaders protested, old guard bureaucrats tried to slow the changes, but MacArthur pressed forward, using his absolute authority to override objections. The American occupation would last 7 years, from 1945 to 1952, but its most dramatic changes came in the first 3 years, a period of revolutionary transformation that would reshape Japan forever. Yet all of these reforms, dramatic as they were, would be meaningless without a fundamental change in how the Japanese people saw themselves and their nation. That change would come from an unlikely source, from the very symbol of the old order, from the emperor himself. For over 2,600 years, according to Japanese mythology, the emperor had been a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. This wasn't metaphorical. Japanese schoolchildren were taught that the emperor was literally divine, that he was infallible, that to look directly at him was sacrilege. The emperor existed in a realm apart from ordinary humanity, hidden behind layers of court ritual and religious mystique. During the war, soldiers had died shouting "Banzai" in the emperor's name. Kamikaze pilots had crashed their planes into American ships, believing they would be reborn in the emperor's divine presence. The entire ideology of Japanese militarism had rested on this foundation of imperial divinity, the belief that Japan was a sacred nation, uniquely chosen, with a divine mission to rule Asia. Now, in January 1946, just 5 months after surrender, Emperor Hirohito would shatter that mythology with a single radio address. It would become known as the Ningen Sengen, the Humanity Declaration, and it would mark one of the most profound transformations in Japanese history. On New Year's Day 1946, Hirohito issued an imperial rescript. Once again, millions of Japanese gathered around radios to hear their emperor speak. But this time the message was radically different. In careful, formal language, Hirohito declared, "The ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection. They do not depend upon mere legends and myths. They are not predicated on the false conception that the emperor is divine and that the Japanese people are superior to other races and fated to rule the world." The words were measured, almost bureaucratic, but their meaning was revolutionary. The emperor, the living god, was declaring himself human. The divine mission of the Japanese people was being explicitly rejected. The entire ideological foundation of Imperial Japan was being dismantled by the emperor himself. The impact was profound and complex. For some Japanese, it was liberating, a release from a crushing burden of expectations and mythology. For others, it was devastating, the final collapse of everything they had believed in. Some wept, some felt betrayed, some felt relief. The nation was processing not just military defeat but spiritual transformation. But Hirohito didn't stop with words. He understood that proclamations alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to demonstrate his new role, to show the Japanese people what it meant for the emperor to be human.
In the months and years that followed, Hirohito did something no emperor had ever done. He went among his people. Not in elaborate ceremonial processions behind silk curtains, but in simple business suits, walking through devastated neighborhoods, visiting farms and factories, talking with ordinary citizens. The images from these tours are remarkable. Here is the former living god standing in a muddy rice paddy discussing crops with farmers. Here he is in a factory wearing a hard hat examining machinery. Here he is in a classroom sitting among schoolchildren. And most striking of all, here he is bowing. The emperor, who had never bowed to anyone, was now bowing to his people as they bowed to him. These tours, which continued for years, served multiple purposes. They showed that the emperor was indeed human, approachable, concerned with the welfare of ordinary Japanese. They provided a visible symbol of continuity and stability during a period of chaotic change, and they demonstrated Hirohito's personal commitment to Japan's transformation. But the emperor's metamorphosis also raised difficult questions that Japan would grapple with for decades. What was Hirohito's responsibility for the war? He had been emperor when Japan invaded China, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, when millions died. Yet he was never tried as a war criminal, never held accountable in any formal way. MacArthur's decision to protect him from prosecution was pragmatic. It aided the occupation and provided stability, but it also meant that Japan's reckoning with its wartime past would be incomplete, complicated, ambiguous. Hirohito would reign until his death in 1989, becoming a symbol of both Japan's troubled past and its peaceful present. The divine emperor who had presided over empire and war became the constitutional monarch who presided over democracy and prosperity. His transformation, from god to man, from absolute ruler to symbolic figurehead, mirrored Japan's own transformation. And that transformation would be codified in a new constitution that would define Japan for generations to come. In February 1946, a team of American lawyers working for General MacArthur gathered in a heavily guarded room in Tokyo. They had 1 week to draft a new constitution for Japan. 1 week to redesign a nation's fundamental law. It was an audacious task, perhaps even an arrogant one, but MacArthur believed that Japan's old Meiji constitution, which had concentrated power in the emperor and the military, had to be completely replaced. A new Japan required new foundations. The team worked around the clock. They studied constitutions from around the world, American, British, German, French. They incorporated the latest thinking on human rights, democracy, and governance. And on February 13th, they presented their draft to shocked Japanese officials, who had been working on their own, much more conservative revisions to the Meiji Constitution. The Japanese government's initial reaction was resistance. This was too radical, they argued, too foreign, too disconnected from Japanese traditions and values. But MacArthur was immovable. Accept this framework, he told them, or he would take it directly to the Japanese people. Faced with that ultimatum, the Japanese government agreed to work with the American draft. What followed was months of intense negotiation, revision, and refinement. Japanese officials and Diet members made hundreds of changes to the American draft, adapting it, improving it, making it more suitable for Japanese circumstances. By the time it was finished, the Constitution had become a genuinely collaborative document, conceived by Americans but significantly shaped by Japanese input. On May 3, 1947, the new Constitution of Japan took effect. It was one of the most progressive, idealistic documents ever created. But one article stood out above all others, Article 9, the Peace Clause. Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces as well as other war potential will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Read those words again. A nation was constitutionally renouncing war, forever. Not just aggressive war, but war itself. Not just for now, but for all time. Japan,
The militant empire that had conquered half of Asia was declaring that it would never again maintain military forces, never again use force to settle disputes. The origins of Article 9 remain somewhat murky. MacArthur claimed it was his idea, inspired by his belief that war itself had become obsolete in the atomic age. Some Japanese officials claimed it emerged from discussions with Prime Minister Kijuro Shidehara, who was deeply committed to pacifism. Regardless of who first proposed it, Article 9 became the moral and legal foundation of post-war Japan, its most distinctive feature, its declaration of a new national identity. Of course, reality would prove more complicated than the idealistic language suggested. Within a few years, as the Cold War intensified and the Korean War broke out, the United States would pressure Japan to rearm. Japan would create self-defense forces, a military in all but name, justified as necessary for self-defense rather than warfare. The contradiction between Article 9's absolute language and Japan's actual defense capabilities would generate endless debate, legal contortions, and political conflict. But even as Japan built one of the world's most technologically advanced militaries, Article 9 remained. Its presence in the Constitution, however much it was reinterpreted, continued to shape Japanese policy and identity.
But Article 9 was just one part of a constitution that fundamentally transformed Japan. Article 1 made clear that sovereignty resided with the people, not the emperor. The emperor became a symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, with no governmental powers whatsoever. Article 14 guaranteed equality under the law and explicitly prohibited discrimination based on race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin. This was revolutionary in a society that had been rigidly hierarchical, where social status had determined opportunities and where women had been legally subordinate to men. Article 21 guaranteed freedom of speech, press, and assembly, rights that had been non-existent under the militarist regime. Article 28 guaranteed the right of workers to organize, bargain collectively, and strike. Article 25 recognized the right to maintain the minimum standards of wholesome and cultured living, making the state responsible for social welfare. The Constitution also established a parliamentary democracy with a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and a prime minister as head of government. Power was dispersed, checked, balanced. The centralization that had enabled militarism was replaced by a system designed to prevent any single faction from dominating. Japanese officials and scholars would spend decades debating whether this constitution was truly Japanese or an imposed document. But the Japanese people themselves embraced it. In surveys, large majorities consistently supported the constitution, particularly Article 9. When conservative politicians proposed revising it, they faced fierce public opposition. The constitution that had been drafted in a week by American lawyers and negotiated by Japanese officials became, over time, genuinely owned by the Japanese people. It provided the legal framework for Japan's transformation. But frameworks alone don't feed people. And in 1946 and 1947, as the Constitution was being drafted and ratified, millions of Japanese were struggling simply to survive. The winter of 1945 to 1946. Japan faced a crisis that threatened to undo everything the occupation was trying to achieve. The nation was starving. The rice harvest had failed. Food production had collapsed. The distribution system had broken down. Inflation was spiraling out of control. And millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians were returning from overseas, adding to the population that needed feeding. In Tokyo, the daily calorie ration fell to 1,050 calories, about half what an adult needs to maintain basic health. In some areas, it dropped even lower. People survived on sweet potato vines, acorns, grass, anything remotely edible. Malnutrition was epidemic. Children showed signs of kwashiorkor and beriberi. The elderly simply gave up, conserving what little food there was for younger family members. Every day, people collapsed on the streets from hunger. Newspapers ran stories of families committing suicide together rather than face slow starvation. In Ueno Park in Tokyo,
Homeless children, orphans whose parents had been killed in the war, formed gangs to survive, stealing food, sleeping in bombed-out buildings. They were called war orphans, and there were tens of thousands of them, ragged and desperate, symbols of just how far Japan had fallen. The black market became essential to survival. In Ueno, Shinjuku, and other areas, makeshift markets sprang up where people could buy and sell anything: rice, clothing, cigarettes, military surplus, family heirlooms. The black market was illegal, but the police looked the other way because everyone understood it was keeping people alive. Former soldiers sold their uniforms. Middle-class families traded silk kimonos for bags of rice. The social order was breaking down as people fought simply to survive. The American occupation forces faced a difficult decision. They had come to demilitarize and democratize Japan, not to feed it. The US military budget was being slashed as wartime forces demobilized. Politicians in Washington questioned why American taxpayers should feed former enemies when Europe also needed help. Some argued that hardship would make Japan more tractable, more willing to accept American reforms. But MacArthur and his staff understood that hungry people don't build democracies, they turn to extremism. If the occupation allowed mass starvation, it would fail. The reforms would be meaningless. So, despite resistance from Washington, MacArthur insisted on emergency food aid. Starting in early 1946, American supply ships began arriving at Japanese ports loaded with wheat, corn, canned goods, and other supplies. It wasn't enough to eliminate hunger, but it prevented mass starvation. The occupation also reformed Japan's agricultural system and food distribution networks, working to make them more efficient and equitable. But American aid alone couldn't save Japan. What was needed was something deeper, a transformation in how Japanese society and economy functioned. And that required the Japanese people themselves to find solutions, to rebuild, to innovate, to persevere.
And they did. The Japanese people discovered within themselves a capacity for endurance that would become legendary. They had a word for it: gaman, enduring the unbearable with patience, dignity, and self-control. Gaman meant not complaining about circumstances you couldn't change. It meant maintaining your humanity and social obligations even in the darkest times. It meant carrying on. Japanese women in particular became the backbone of recovery. With so many men dead or incapacitated, women took on roles that had previously been unthinkable. They cleared rubble, rebuilt homes, ran businesses, led community organizations. In the countryside, women did the back-breaking work of farming with primitive tools. In the cities, they stood in ration lines, bartered in black markets, kept families together through sheer force of will. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to improve. By 1947, food production was increasing. By 1948, the economy was stabilizing. The immediate crisis had passed. But Japan was still desperately poor, still struggling, still far from the prosperous nation it would become. What gave people hope was not just material improvement, but a sense that they were building something new. The reforms, democracy, women's rights, labor protections, land ownership, gave ordinary Japanese a stake in the future. For the first time in their lives, many Japanese felt they had agency, that their efforts mattered, that they could shape their own destinies. There was something else too. A collective determination that Japan would not just survive but thrive, that the nation that had been so thoroughly defeated would prove its resilience in a different way, not through military conquest but through economic success, not through domination but through excellence. By 1950, the worst hardships had passed. Japan was still poor by Western standards, but it was no longer starving. The foundations had been laid: democratic institutions, legal reforms, social changes. Now came the question: what would Japan build on those foundations? The answer would astonish the world.
The 1950s and 1960s. What came next would be called the Japanese economic miracle, and the name was well deserved. Between 1955 and 1973, Japan's economy grew at an average annual rate of 9.2%. To put that in perspective, in less than 2 decades, Japan went from a devastated, impoverished nation to the world's second largest economy, behind only the United States. The numbers are staggering.
In 1950, Japan's GDP was $91 billion. By 1970, it was $1.07 trillion, nearly a 12-fold increase. Industrial production increased 17-fold. Exports grew from $820 million in 1950 to $19.3 billion in 1970. Living standards rose dramatically. Products that had been unimaginable luxuries, televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, automobiles, became common in middle-class homes. How did this happen? How did a nation that had been utterly defeated, that had lost its empire, that had started from absolute zero, achieve such spectacular growth? There's no single answer, but rather a combination of factors that came together in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. First, paradoxically, defeat had cleared the ground for growth. Japan's cities had been destroyed, but that meant they could be rebuilt with the most modern infrastructure. Japan's old industrial machinery had been wrecked, but that meant new factories could be built with the latest technology. Countries that hadn't been destroyed were stuck with aging equipment and outdated layouts. Japan could start fresh. Second, Article 9 and Japan's minimal defense spending freed up enormous resources for economic development. While other nations spent 5, 10, even 15% of GDP on military forces, Japan spent less than 1%. That money went instead into education, infrastructure, and industrial investment. Japan didn't need to develop weapon systems or maintain bases around the world. It could focus entirely on economic growth. Third, American policy actively supported Japan's recovery. Initially, the occupation had wanted to keep Japan weak and agrarian. But the communist victory in China in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 changed everything. Suddenly, the United States needed a strong, stable, capitalist Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. American aid poured in. American markets opened to Japanese goods. American technology and management techniques were shared.
Fourth, and perhaps most important, was Japanese management philosophy and work culture. Companies adopted the Kaizen principle, continuous improvement. Every worker, from the CEO to the assembly line operator, was expected to constantly look for ways to make things better, more efficient, higher quality. Problems weren't blamed on individuals but treated as system failures that required collective solutions. Japanese companies pioneered just-in-time manufacturing, where parts arrived exactly when needed, minimizing inventory costs. They emphasized quality control at every stage of production, rather than inspecting finished products. They invested heavily in worker training and created lifetime employment systems that built loyalty and expertise. The Japanese workforce became legendary. Workers routinely stayed late, worked weekends, socialized with colleagues, identified personally with their company's success. American observers called them workaholics and worried about the social costs. But for many Japanese, their companies provided not just employment, but identity, community, and purpose, replacing, in some ways, the social structures that had been destroyed by defeat. Fifth, Japan targeted specific industries strategically. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, guided industrial policy, identifying sectors where Japan could compete globally and directing resources there. Japan focused on manufacturing, first textiles and light industry, then steel and shipbuilding, then automobiles and electronics. Made in Japan had initially been synonymous with cheap, low-quality imitations. Japanese toys, cameras and radios in the early 1950s were considered inferior knockoffs of Western products. But Japanese companies learned fast, improved relentlessly, and eventually didn't just match Western quality, but exceeded it. By the 1960s, the world was taking notice. Japanese steel was the world's most efficiently produced. Japanese ships were the most advanced. Japanese automobiles, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Mazda, were gaining reputation for reliability and fuel efficiency. Japanese electronics, Sony, Panasonic, Hitachi, Toshiba, were becoming global brands. Sony's transistor radio, released in 1955, showed what Japan could do. It was small, portable, and high quality, and it created an entirely new market.
Sony's co-founder Akio Morita became a symbol of the new Japan. Innovative, entrepreneurial, globally minded. In 1964, Japan hosted the Summer Olympics in Tokyo, an event that showcased the new Japan to the world. For many Americans and Europeans, it was a revelation. This wasn't the defeated, impoverished nation they remembered from newsreels. This was a modern, dynamic society with stunning infrastructure and technological prowess. The symbol of this transformation was the Shinkansen, the bullet train. Launched just before the Olympics, connecting Tokyo and Osaka at speeds of 130 miles per hour, the Shinkansen was fast, safe, punctual to the second, and a glimpse of the future. For the Japanese, the bullet train represented what they had become: precise, efficient, forward-looking. By 1968, Japan's economy had become the second largest in the world, surpassing West Germany. The nation that had been in ruins 23 years earlier was now an economic superpower. Japanese companies were competing globally. Japanese products were everywhere. Japanese management techniques were being studied and copied around the world. But with economic success came new questions. Who were the Japanese now? What did it mean to be Japanese in this modern, prosperous, westernized society? How could traditional values be preserved while embracing change? These questions of identity and culture would define the next phase of Japan's journey.
But Japanese identity wasn't just about war and memory. It was also about continuity, about maintaining connections to cultural traditions that stretched back centuries. And here Japan found a distinctive path. Traditional arts didn't disappear. They were preserved, honored, elevated. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, calligraphy, martial arts, these practices continued, often with more conscious intention, precisely because modernity threatened them. People who worked all week in high-tech offices might spend weekends studying traditional arts, finding in them something essential about being Japanese. Craftsmanship remained central to Japanese identity. The concept of shokunin, the master craftsman who dedicates a lifetime to perfecting a skill, persisted even in the industrial age. Whether it was a sushi chef spending years learning to properly cook rice, a sword maker following techniques unchanged for centuries, or a Toyota engineer obsessing over manufacturing perfection, the spirit was similar. Dedication to excellence, attention to detail, pride in work. Japan discovered that it didn't have to choose between tradition and modernity. The samurai spirit of discipline and honor could find expression not in warfare, but in business, in craftsmanship, in the relentless pursuit of quality. The values of harmony, respect, and social obligation could coexist with democracy and individual rights. The aesthetic sensibilities that had produced ancient temples and gardens could also create elegant electronics and efficient cars. This synthesis wasn't always easy or complete. Tensions remained. Young people sometimes chafed at traditional expectations. Women struggled against persistent gender inequality, despite constitutional guarantees. The pressure to conform, to fulfill social obligations, to work excessive hours took psychological tolls. The country that had achieved so much economically still wrestled with questions of individual versus collective, tradition versus progress, Japan versus the world. But by the 1970s and 1980s, a distinctive post-war Japanese identity had emerged. It was democratic, but not individualistic in the American sense. It was modern, but not westernized. It was peaceful, but not weak. It was proud, but not militaristic. It was uniquely Japanese while being fully engaged with the world. The nation that had rebuilt from ruins had created not just a new economy, but a new vision of what it meant to be Japanese. And that transformation, from empire to democracy, from militarism to pacifism, from poverty to prosperity, stands as one of the most remarkable stories in modern history. By the 1970s, Japan had achieved something remarkable. It had become modern without becoming Western. But that achievement came with profound questions about identity. Who were the Japanese now? In just 25 years, they had transformed from imperial subjects of a divine emperor to citizens of a democratic nation, from a militaristic empire to a pacifist economic power, from isolation to global integration.
Walking through Tokyo, Osaka, or any major Japanese city, you could see the contradictions everywhere. Salarymen in Western business suits rushed to work in glass office towers, passing ancient wooden shrines where elderly women in kimono offered prayers. Teenagers in the latest American fashions browsed record stores selling both the Beatles and traditional enka music. McDonald's restaurants opened next door to sushi bars that had been serving customers for generations. Some worried that Japan was losing its soul, that modernization meant westernization, that ancient traditions and values were being abandoned in the pursuit of economic growth. Others argued that Japan was successfully synthesizing East and West, creating something uniquely Japanese that honored tradition while embracing modernity. The question of identity was particularly acute because Japan's rapid transformation had been so compressed, so intense. In Europe and America, modernization had taken centuries. Societies had time to adapt, to negotiate between old and new, to gradually evolve. Japan had compressed that process into a few decades. The grandparents who remembered the Meiji era lived to see their grandchildren working at Sony and Honda, traveling abroad, living lives their ancestors couldn't have imagined. At the heart of Japan's identity struggle was the question of how to remember the war. This wasn't an abstract historical debate, it was deeply personal. Every family had lost someone. Every city bore scars. And two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, carried wounds unlike any other places on Earth. The atomic bomb survivors, the Hibakusha, became living witnesses to the horrors of nuclear war. Many initially hid their status, fearing discrimination. The radiation sickness, the keloid scars, the genetic damage, all marked them as different, damaged. But gradually, many Hibakusha chose to speak out, not seeking revenge or compensation, but bearing witness and advocating for peace. Hiroshima itself became a symbol of Japan's transformation. The city that had been obliterated now dedicated itself to peace. The ruins of the Industrial Promotion Hall, now called the A-Bomb Dome, were preserved as a permanent reminder. Peace Memorial Park was created at Ground Zero. Every year on August 6th, the anniversary of the bombing, the mayor of Hiroshima would read a declaration calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons. This was Japan's choice, to remember the horror, not to foster hatred, but to advocate for peace. The Hibakusha became not symbols of victimhood, but voices of conscience. Their message wasn't, "Look what was done to us," but "This must never happen to anyone again." Yet Japan's reckoning with its wartime past was incomplete and controversial. While Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of peace, there was less discussion of Japan's own wartime atrocities: the rape of Nanking, the comfort women system, the brutal occupation of Korea and Southeast Asia, the medical experiments, the forced labor. Some Japanese acknowledged these crimes and apologized. Others denied or minimized them. Conservative politicians visited Yasukuni Shrine, which honors Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, sparking outrage in China and Korea. This tension between Japan as victim of atomic bombing and Japan as perpetrator of wartime atrocities remained unresolved. Different groups emphasized different narratives. Progressives focused on Japan's suffering and commitment to peace. Conservatives emphasized Japan's honor and rejected what they called a masochistic view of history. Neighbors in Asia watched carefully, unsatisfied with Japan's acknowledgement of past wrongs. Today, 8 decades after the surrender, Japan stands as one of the world's most prosperous, stable, and peaceful nations. The third largest economy globally, a leader in technology and innovation. A society with one of the highest life expectancies, lowest crime rates, and most efficient infrastructure on Earth. The transformation is complete, and yet, in many ways, ongoing. The economic miracle that lifted Japan from poverty to prosperity in the 1950s and 60s continued through the 1970s and 80s. By 1989, when Emperor Hirohito died and the Showa era ended, Japan was at its peak. Japanese companies dominated global markets. Japanese investors were purchasing landmarks around the world. Japanese management techniques were studied in business schools from Harvard to Harvard. Some predicted that the 21st century would be the Japanese century, just as the 20th had been the American century. Then came the bubble burst. In the 1990s, inflated real estate and stock prices collapsed, triggering decades of economic stagnation that came to be called the lost decades. Japan's growth slowed dramatically. Other Asian nations, South Korea, Taiwan, China, rose to challenge Japanese dominance. Japan faced new problems: an aging population, mounting government debt, deflation, economic inequality. But even in relative decline, Japan remained one of the world's most successful societies. Its people enjoyed high living standards, excellent education, universal healthcare, and remarkable safety. Japanese companies continued to excel in quality and innovation. Japanese culture, anime, manga, video games, cuisine, fashion, achieved global influence far exceeding Japan's population or geography. More importantly, Japan had achieved something that no amount of economic growth can guarantee. It had become a peaceful, stable democracy. The reforms imposed during occupation had taken root. Democratic institutions functioned smoothly. Peaceful transfers of power occurred regularly. Citizens enjoyed extensive freedoms. The rule of law prevailed. Article 9, the Peace Clause, remained in the Constitution despite ongoing debates about revision. Japan maintained self-defense forces and a close security alliance with the United States, but it hadn't fought a war in 80 years. It hadn't sent soldiers into combat. It had become, as the Constitution intended, a nation that resolved disputes through diplomacy rather than force. Japan also became a global leader in humanitarian assistance and development aid. Japanese engineers built infrastructure across Asia and Africa. Japanese aid workers responded to disasters worldwide. The nation that had once conquered its neighbors now assisted them. The change was profound. Of course, challenges remained. Japan still struggled with its wartime legacy, particularly in relations with China and Korea. Constitutional debates about Article 9 continued. Gender inequality persisted despite legal equality. An aging society faced difficult questions about immigration, social services, and economic growth. The pressure cooker education system and demanding work culture took psychological tolls. But these were the problems of a successful, mature democracy. Difficult but manageable, debated openly, addressed through democratic processes. They were fundamentally different from the existential crises Japan had faced in 1945.
The legacy of Japan's transformation extends beyond Japan itself. It demonstrated that nations can change fundamentally, that enemies can become allies, that defeat need not be permanent, that militaristic societies can become peaceful democracies. Germany underwent a similar transformation, but Japan's was in some ways more dramatic because it was more complete. Japan went from divine emperor to constitutional monarchy, from empire to renunciation of war, from Asian isolation to global integration. The cultural distance traveled was immense. Japan's experience offered lessons that resonate today, that international cooperation can work, that former enemies can reconcile, that economic development doesn't require military aggression, that democracy can flourish in non-Western contexts, that cultures can modernize without losing their identity. The story also reminds us of costs. The transformation required occupation, the loss of sovereignty, the imposition of institutions designed by foreigners. It required national humiliation, wrenching change, and the abandonment of traditional values. Not every nation could or should follow the same path. Japan's transformation was unique to its circumstances, its culture, its history. But the essential lesson remains: that change is possible. That nations, like individuals, can learn from mistakes, can grow, can become something better than they were. That the arc of history, however long and painful, can bend toward justice, peace, and prosperity. August 15th, 1945. A nation lay in ruins. Cities destroyed, millions dead, an empire lost, a people facing absolute zero, uncertain whether they would survive, much less thrive.
80 years later, that nation stands transformed, not by conquest or domination, but by resilience, adaptation, and the courage to change. The story of Japan after World War II is not one of defeat, but of rebirth. From the ashes of Hiroshima rose a commitment to peace that has endured for 8 decades. From the humiliation of occupation came a partnership that rebuilt a nation. From the renunciation of military power came economic strength that lifted millions into prosperity. From the darkest moment in their history, the Japanese people created a future of hope. They discovered that a nation's strength isn't measured in weapons or territory, but in the resilience of its people. That honor can be found not just in victory, but in the courage to admit defeat and chart a new course. That identity doesn't require isolation or domination, but can flourish through openness and exchange. Japan rebuilt more than buildings and factories. It rebuilt its spirit, its values, its vision of itself. The warrior nation became a pacifist power. The divine empire became a humble democracy. The isolated island nation became a global citizen. The transformation wasn't perfect. Wounds remained. Questions persisted. Challenges continued. But the fundamental achievement was undeniable. Japan had reinvented itself, had proven that even the most devastating defeat can become the foundation for rebirth. Today, as we face our own challenges, conflict, division, uncertainty, Japan's story reminds us of what's possible. That nations can change, that enemies can reconcile, that from utter devastation can emerge lasting peace and prosperity. The story of Japan after the war is ultimately a story about human resilience, about the capacity for transformation, about the power of hope, even in the darkest times. From ruins to renaissance, from empire to democracy, from war to peace. This is the story of Japan's rebirth, and it remains one of history's most extraordinary journeys, a testament to humanity's ability to overcome, to adapt, to build something better from the ashes of destruction.